Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Show Me SaaS. I've really been looking forward to sort of launching this effort and getting this show off the ground. We've been working on a lot of SaaS concepts as a team for a long while here, and I've really wanted to try to sort of create this broader sort of mechanism for us to be able to more directly engage SaaS developers and architects and builders and really get into the weeds of SaaS problems and engage a little more interactively in a way here where we can hear what you're working on and what's working, what's not, and then share the experiences we're having collectively as a team. And my name's Todd Golding. I've been working on SaaS sort of bits here for the last few years here at AWS. And I'm fortunate to be joined by members of the team that work with me here that are also deeply immersed in SaaS day-to-day kind of problems and are part of the sort of ongoing dialogue we're always having about what's good SaaS and what are the right ways to build SaaS and so on. So I've got Michael Beardsley here. Michael, you want to raise your hand? Michael's been in every sort of flavor of SaaS kind of problem you can imagine, and we've probably debated like 100 variations of what it really means to implement SaaS. So we hope maybe you'll get a little bit of exposure to that ongoing discussion. Bill Tarr, Bill, you want to raise your hand there? Bill with the really cool guitar in the background, gotta love that. I told him I need a better background, but I haven't quite come up with one yet. But Bill's been active just generally in the community and out on Twitch and other forums in terms of sharing his perspectives on SaaS. Probably he's been a little more in the startup space, although he certainly covers the entire landscape of SaaS. And then Toby, you want to raise your hand? Toby has really been kind of in the weeds of lots of sort of SaaS building in his time here at AWS, obviously working with customers, but also like building our EKS reference architecture with other members of the team, building workshops. And so he's been in the nuts and bolts of lots of this. And certainly, as we get into the IDE versions of this, I'm counting on Toby to crack open his Visual Studio Code and show us his fancy fonts and all the other cool things he has that we always tease him about. But really, I want to frame up this first episode because obviously across this experience, we're going to have a sort of a lot of granularity. Some of our sessions are going to be fundamentals of core concepts that we think really are key to really sort of getting your mind around what it means to build SaaS. Others are going to be just in the weeds deep dives of crack open the IDE, like I said, and really get into code and really hopefully get again the dialogue going with you about what you think about these things. But today, like, we're starting this off, it's our first episode, and I really thought it's important to sort of set the table here a little bit for what it is we mean when we talk about SaaS and what are some of these real sort of core patterns that we see. Because really, if you don't sort of have your head around that thing, it's hard as we dig into these deeper topics to really have a good understanding of what some of these bits are and what the terminology is sometimes we use. And one of the really sort of common challenges I see, like when I engage people and they come to me and talk to me about SaaS, is they're like, show me a blueprint, like give me a blueprint, show me how to build SaaS, give me this, package it up, hand it to me, and I'll just go build it. But what we see is that SaaS just doesn't work that way, right? So this is often a painful conversation because somebody's like, just show me how. And then we have like 100 questions that are all like, it depends. And like, tell us more, right? Maybe Michael, I'll throw to you a little bit here. And like, you have had to have had these kind of discussions with customers where they're show up, they're already with their tech team and they're like, what pattern, show me where to go. Have you seen some of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the challenge that we see is that SaaS is really a way to run your business, right? It's really a option for how to deliver your product and interact with your customers. And it's not a technology stack per se in and of itself. And so while we could make a blueprint, for example, how to deploy and configure a highly available web server, right? There's a blueprint for that. We could make a blueprint for how to set up a relational database cluster, but we can't really make a blueprint for how you are going to run your business. And so they want the security blanket of being told, oh, there is one right way to do it, but there isn't one right way to run whatever your product is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good way to frame it, right? Which is that yes, there's this sort of set of patterns out there, and yes, we can tell you like, oh, if you're doing isolation and you're on EKS, like we can tell you like, here's some of the things you ought to think about. But where is like what are you actually doing with EKS? What do the customers really need? What is the business trying to achieve? Even as you're starting out, right, greenfield, right, trying to do this, like Bill, I imagine in the startup space, like this is still, I assume, the front part of the discussions you might have with startups.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the good news is, Todd, I mean, you've been doing this for a few years, and once upon a time, I think we spent more time describing the value proposition of SaaS, of why you want to do SaaS. And the exciting thing for me working with startups is they're often coming to the conversations now bought in. They want to do SaaS. They understand the value proposition of, you know, why investors are interested in SaaS and why it's a good thing for their customers and for them. But they're bringing this huge diversity also of different business models and different technical challenges. So you're right, that first opportunity to step back and say, okay, I understand you want to do SaaS. Our first step isn't to go do a reference, an implementation or a POC. Our first step is to figure out who your customers are and what your business needs are and what your goals are. You know, you're trying to grow. Are you trying to make it more efficient? What are you trying to get out of SaaS? And having that first conversation and getting them to think holistically about SaaS is really the first step of every conversation I have with a startup customer.
Yeah. Well, and Toby, like obviously you worked on the EKS reference architecture, and we built this thing called a reference architecture. And I think it's kind of a highlight of this blueprint sort of just challenge, which is it's a reference architecture, but I think we say it's a reference architecture. Maybe you could elaborate on like even the nuance of that, right? We're already in EKS, we're already like narrowed it down, and yet we still just say it's a reference architecture. Like, what's the deal there? Like, why isn't it the reference architecture?
Well, yeah, that was something we struggled with when we first started, right? Because the term reference architecture, I think, denotes, you know, it is the reference, and if we were hesitant to call it a reference architecture. We wanted to call it something different. We settled on reference architecture, but at the end of the day, we think of it as a reference architecture in that there are referenceable pieces in there. You could pick them up, you could apply them to your environment. You could, you know, it's an end-to-end kind of a culmination of many different practices, some of which won't apply, some of which will, you know, a la carte, if you will, use the pieces you want, and but just understand that it's a way to solve the problem, not the way to solve the problem.
Yeah, and I think, you know, before we maybe dig into like specific what some of those sort of flavors of patterns are, since we're acknowledging there's not a blueprint here, I think part of the sort of complexity of this problem is the definition of the notion of multi-tenant, right? Because I know at least when I showed up and started working on SaaS, like when we talked about multi-tenant, it had this very sort of it had this resource sort of connotation. Like, is this resource multi-tenant, right? Are we going to consume it together? Are we going to somehow share and pool the resources amongst all these consumers of it? And that definition is still true. I mean, AWS's infrastructure is multi-tenant, right? Even if it's not SaaS, it's multi-tenant, and that people are sharing resources. But as we've kind of worked with customers and more try to develop this vocabulary, I think we've defined a different boundary for what we would use. That doesn't mean that there aren't other definitions. What we would use to describe multi-tenant. So maybe I'll just continue my pattern here, Michael, and come back to you here a little bit. And like, how is our definition of multi-tenant maybe a little bit different than that classic definition?
Yeah, I think sometimes you'll even hear the term single tenant SaaS, which to me is like, what does that mean, right? That means you have one customer. I'm pretty sure you have more than one customer. I think what people mean by that is not shared infrastructure, right? To your point that that people are defining tenancy by the infrastructure resources and whether or not they're shared or not. And we really think of SaaS more as, how are you operating your solution? Are you operating your solution with a single pane of glass over understanding who all of your tenants are, how you're deploying your solution, how you're versioning your solution, the fact that all of your customers, all of your tenants are running the same version of your solution. And if there's tweak and nuance, you don't do it by different versions, you do it by configurations and tiering and other ways that you can package up your offering. So I do think it's a really critical point to put out, that we come to the conversation thinking about there's multi-tenancy. Every SaaS solution is multi-tenant, and whether you assign infrastructure resources per tenant or whether you share some of those, that's different. That's an isolation pattern. That's not the definition of SaaS.
Yeah, I cheated a little here, and I tried to put together a slide here to try to like help drive this discussion a little bit. Because we talk about like having this single pane of glass that manages and operates everything SaaS, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. But we was talking about onboarding and identity and all these things you have to have that are sort of core to SaaS. But generally, this notion of multi-tenant is often about the deployment sort of footprint of your application and what is the correlation between resources and tenants. And this sort of slide to me is the classic definition of like SaaS in the way that most people originally think of it. Everything's shared. Tenants are sharing all their compute. They're sharing all the storage. You're getting all these great economies of scale. And I think nobody would debate that is multi-tenant. But where, to me, it gets a little more interesting is when I have maybe an architecture that looks like this. Still the same pane of glass, still everything's shared. But the tenants are running entirely isolated infrastructure. They're not, and this could be any number of permutations of AWS infrastructure or whatever infrastructure you're running for your environments here. But they're fully isolated. So I would show this to somebody and you'd say, is this multi-tenant? And I guess maybe Bill, I'll ask you that. How do you describe or solve this for somebody who's like trying to wrestle with it, whether that's multi-tenant or not?
Yeah, and it comes up a lot, right? When we first start talking to customers, usually multi-tenant is the first term we're hearing. You just try to gently steer it toward that there's different models, right? That there's a pooled model and perhaps a silo model that we're going to talk about more, I think, as we go on here.
Yeah.
And also that there isn't a single choice for your customers either. We may have tiers of customers, that we might have different versions of these isolation models for different customers, even in the same stack. But what we're looking at in this picture, all of those outlying pieces remain the same, right? So if you're going to have different models for isolation for your individual tenants, it doesn't mean you don't need any of these outlying pieces. And if you have those mixed models, having these outlying pieces like onboarding and identity being distinct as something around those individual pieces makes the experience for you as the provider seamless and painless. And when it would be very hard to manage all those things in the individual isolated data accounts.
So what I try to do for myself, at least, to simplify this is to say, I think of tenancy more through the lens of the customer. Like from the customer's perspective, do they onboard through a common experience and maybe from an operational perspective as well? Like, can I operate it collectively? And maybe the biggest one here is deployment, right? When we're deploying in these environments, all customers get the same version of the software, right? That's often the dividing line in a lot of conversations with people where they're like, yeah, we're all in for SaaS, we're all in for multi-tenant. Okay, so everybody's going to run the same version. Well, kind of like we're going to, right? We kind of get that sort of twist there. And often that's a point of tension here. And this discussion, I have one more variation of this, right? Which is that I think is the other thing here, which is, and maybe Toby, you've seen this a little bit. I know in the workshop you guys did some of this a little bit that you did for EKS, which is maybe we have to support multiple models inside of this environment based on different types of tenant needs. Didn't you guys do something around that with a workshop, if I remember right?
We did, and I think that to some extent that mirrors reality, right? Where you might want to offer a free tier where everybody's glommed, and maybe the appetite for isolation is a little higher or a little lower, where they don't care that they're commingling with other tenants or something like that. And so we did it based on tier. So in the EKS SaaS workshop, if you are a basic tenant, you'll go into the pool with all the other tenants. And if you are a premier or premium tenant, we'll dedicate a whole stack of infrastructure for you.
Yeah, and it's actually, we won't have time in this episode to go there, but I could, and certainly in future episodes, what we see is this opening up a whole new sort of discussion on the DevOps sort of side of the house, right? Which is, hey, now when I'm onboarding, I'm not just like putting an entry into a database and creating an identity for a user. I have to have all these infrastructure automation to figure out, and deployment considerations to say, hey, you're what tier are you, and where are you going to land, and which infrastructure needs to be provisioned for you, and all these other bits that I think will be a really good source for a future episode, but it'll probably take us a little off track here for this one. But okay, so for me, we've got this notion of multi-tenancy. We know there's no blueprint, but then the question is, there must be some patterns, right? Like there must be some sort of higher level guidance we give to people to say, okay, if we just take a step back and say, like, fundamentally, are there some things we would see in every SaaS application? I believe there are things that we see there. I guess I'll ask any of you, like we talk about this idea of control plane and application plane, right? This, we've decomposed at the high level, this idea. I've got a slide, I'll throw it on a second here, but we've talked about trying to at least decompose this into the two halves of SaaS, a control plane and an application plane, that we think represent a common pattern that would be true for every SaaS application.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious for any of you, like, does the problem naturally break apart that way for you, or is there some higher level way that you think about decomposing this?
I think that's really at the most coarse grain, right? So before we get into patterns where you might start talking about specific technologies like Kubernetes or like databases or file storage or what have you, if you back up a little bit, we do believe, we are of the opinion at AWS that a good SaaS operation should have those cross-cutting concerns that you saw in those diagrams. Things like onboarding and DevOps and billing and metering and tenant management, those kinds of things, that's what we're talking about when we talk about a control plane. Yeah. And it kind of doesn't matter what your solution is. But if you want to operate your business in a SaaS model and you want to deliver your product to your customers in a SaaS model, you're going to need some or all of those pieces. And so if we could come up with patterns around that, then now we're talking about something that can be repeatable. Versus what's inside the application, and that's really hard to say that there's anything repeatable. But there are patterns in there, which I know we'll dig into more.
Yeah. Anybody else have anything to add? Is that already kind of top it off for you?
I would just say I agree 100% with Michael. Your question was around, is it something that just breaks apart organically, or is there something else that you kind of have to think about? And I would say that it's not always that. It's kind of like when you're just coding, right? You know what the patterns are, you know what you should be striving for good, encapsulation and all of that stuff. But it's not. Sometimes those lines get blurry, and you have to make these eyes wide open decisions on is this control plane, is this application plane? But keeping that as a mental model, I think, is helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and you start to see patterns with certain services, even, right, where we might get a little bit into networking later about how these different layers can connect, different services which make it easier to do these things, and different types of customers who even have different needs for these patterns, right? You might start to see customers who have some specific need to actually still have on-prem components. And we've discussed that in some of our blogs as well. So these different patterns emerge and different solutions emerge for those different customers. There's not a one size fits all for SaaS at all.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just throw up here, like, just so people have some sense of, like, when we're talking about control plane and app plane, like, what's that division look like? And what's in this box in the control plane might vary some for you and vary based on what's in your environment. But for me, the common conversation I have with people, because a lot of people are saying, we're going to SaaS, where should we start? and they're always wanting to start with like, what's our isolation model? What's our data partitioning model? They want to have that discussion. And I'm like, yeah, those are all really good things. And we got to figure all those things out. But like on day one, I want to be building at least pieces of this control plane, because for me, if I don't really have a way to onboard tenants, I don't have a really good way to like represent their identity. If I'm not sort of have some light way to think about like metrics and tiering and things like that, I can't sort of pause those things and say, well, eventually we'll add those, but we'll start with the application first. So probably my biggest guidance that I give to people is like, you don't like, again, you can evolve this control plane, but it is the thing that most forces you to think about what it means to be a multi-tenant business, to be a SaaS business.
And I feel like, I don't know what you guys think, but I feel like customers, they understand that there has to be a way to register, or we give it a different name. We don't just call it registration. We call it onboarding because it encompasses so much more about, it's not just registering a new customer onto your platform. It's how do you get them ready to get to that, that first point of value of usage of your solution. So we don't need to dive into that right now, but I do feel like they look at this list of things and they're like, oh yeah, well, we're going to do onboarding. I had no idea I needed to do all this other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that's a common tendency, especially, from a in the weeds guy's perspective. You want to focus on the stuff that adds value, right? Like what's your secret sauce? What is it you're offering? What is it that makes your business go? And it's not so much it's not so much the supporting stuff, right? But it's super important, because if you don't think about those things early and often, it's sometimes hard to go back and retrofit all those blue boxes.
I just chime in on that. I've worked with some customers who deferred onboarding and identity in some of those stories into their growth phase. So they were trying to onboard customers as rapidly as possible, still add features, basically spinning the hamster wheel as fast as they could at that point. And the technical debt that they were incurring doing that is exactly what you'd expect it to be, right? When you have 10 tenants, it's not that big a deal. When you have 500, all of a sudden you're scrambling around trying to fix all of these things that you just laid out, without any planning to begin with. Earlier, you put that in front of your customers and get your customers using those tools, the better long-term ability you'll have to manage those, right? And you won't have to go back and redo everything you did in the beginning with your little clunky fake onboarding and identity story that wasn't really external to your app.
So Todd, I guess sort of, send it back to the moderator here, right? Like, should customers think about these as if I move to SaaS, I don't just have one thing to build. Now I've got two things to build. I've got my application that is bringing value to my customers and my market opportunity that I have. But now I've got this whole other basically solution, this application that I have to build and version and deploy and manage and test. How do we help people with that? How do we want to think about that? Is this part of the SaaS solution, or is it separate?
Yeah, it's a great call out, because I do think it's sort of and I think we're all around the edges of this already, which is, it is all additive to me. It is all something new and separate. And I think it has its own, we even show here an admin console, because it has its own users of this system that are entirely different than your system. How are you going to, as a business, like manage tenants and do cross-cutting things across tenants? In fact, one of the ironic things is this control plane isn't multi-tenant at all, right? Like, it is managing everything in the app plane that is multi-tenant, but it is your experience as a business. And this is where, like, we push metrics, for example, as a huge piece of SaaS. And how are you even going to have your finger on the pulse of what tenants are doing and not doing? And if you don't build this out, you won't have that visibility into it. So for me, we start this discussion by saying SaaS is a business model all the time. And a whole lot of that business model gets realized through the efficiency and the agility and your ability to move and pivot and deploy efficiently and grow your sort of capabilities as a system. And that's facilitated in a large way by this control plane. And so I do see it as something entirely different. And in fact, you'll see in our own team as we worked on things, right? We build reference architecture, we build another reference architecture, and we sort of even on our own went, oh gosh, there's this control plane that's common to every single thing we're building, and we're building it over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
We should be packaging that all up. And now as we started to explain this to customers, they're starting to say, yeah, that totally resonates with me. Like we were building a control plane and we didn't even know we were building a control plane. And by carving it out and thinking about it separately, it resonates. And the versioning part, I love that you asked here, right? Which is that like this truly to me is like something entirely separately managed and versioned. Now I say, and I'll get off my soapbox in a second here. I will say that this can have I've seen engineering teams look at this control plane and think, oh, we need to go build a whole nother horizontal team and build all these massive teams that will all own our horizontal bits. And they'll detach from the application plane thinking we can build all this in a vacuum. And that is not what I'm advocating here. I think what happens in that application plane has a huge influence on what end up in your control plane. Yes, these are common themes and they'll be implemented and with common bits, and something will be common to all apps. But those two should be evolving together, and those tunes ought to be working together.
Well, it's the arrows, right, on the diagram. So such a small thing, and but it's so important, and it's because of that communication back and forth, and what is that communication? What does it mean, and how do you do it? That's why you can't build these things in a vacuum from one another.
Yeah, I would even say like I wasn't sure I was going to show this or not because there's too many implementations of this to really have one diagram for it. But if you step back from this diagram conceptually, all I'm trying to convey here in this diagram was, hey, you're going to build this control plane, and here I showed an example of a control plane running in a VPC. Well, now when we get into the app plane and we start looking at the different ways you can deploy an app plane, you have to think about what the integration with that app plane looks like, and which mechanisms are you going to use, which network constructs, how much visibility do you want, how does that affect your sort of security and your isolation story of your application? What is that just contract between the control plane and the app plane? And I think that's another piece that you don't want to wait to think about. You want to be pretty proactive about that.
Hey, Todd, I wanted to call out that I just dropped one of your reInvent sessions on SaaS architecture patterns into the comments in case anybody wants to follow up. We're starting to get into some depth on some details here. I thought it'd be good to get some of these links out.
Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah. And obviously, yeah. And if anybody's in the chat there interested at all in asking a question along the way, feel free to jump in. But I guess for me, like maybe the takeaway of this section I would like people to have is that, like, to me, the control plane and the app plane are where I'm going to start a whole lot of these discussions. And like, yes, eventually I'm going to care what's in that app plane, but like, what are you going to do for onboarding? Like, what is that going to look like, right? Like, what are the tiering sort of bits? And these are often business related discussions. And lots of people working on SaaS don't always have business people in those discussions. And I would say to somebody, like, that's part of the challenge of Show Me SaaS here, right? Like, everybody's going to want to be here, show me code. And I'm going to say to you, like, as a SaaS builder and an architect, you better be equally interested in the business sort of correlation of these things.
So we know that there's this repeatable need for an operational pane of glass that surrounds your solution. We've touched on, but didn't really dive into the details of the fact that that's going to have to talk to your application, and they're going to have to work together to give that frictionless onboarding experience and all the other operational bits that we want in SaaS. But I guess we haven't started talking about, how are we modeling the application side when we go to deploy this, and are there patterns there that we could talk about, and what are the benefits and what are some of the overhead of some of those different patterns? Yeah,
that's the perfect setup, Michael, right? Which is like to me, yes, okay, control plane, we've got it teed up, but the reality is the app plane, to me, like this whole blueprints discussion, you could argue for control plane, there's blueprinty kind of things in there. Like it's closer to a blueprint. When you get over to the app plane side of this, like like the blueprint sort of notions get way more granular. The directions you could go get way more exotic. And so there's a whole lot more to think about over there. And honestly, that's the area most people want to talk about the most. I usually feel like we're sort of suggesting that they make the control plane a priority, but everybody's interested in what the
you got to eat your vegetables, right?
Yeah.
With the control plane, but they want to get to the good stuff.
Right? Absolutely. And so maybe the question is like, for me always is like, how do I start that app plane discussion? Like, what are the higher level? I'm working on a patterns bit of stuff for SaaS right now. We've got another effort underway where we're trying to get a cleaner taxonomy of SaaS. And when you get over into this application plane, I'm the current sort of conversation I've been having with myself is like, where do you start? Like, what are the higher level sort of bits here? And I'm curious where I put you on the spot because we might all start at different places. I haven't ever asked you this question, but where do you start for yourselves?
I always start with identity, right? So I always start with trying to get the customer to articulate to me who their customer is, so that we can actually come to an agreement on who their tenants are going to be, and that naturally exposes a lot of the business discussion, which can get us started on the road of understanding what their needs are for isolation, and maybe educating a little bit about what their options are for isolating tenants, so that they don't feel like they have to do the same thing for everything. And I know we're going to dig into that a little bit more, but I think there's this natural tendency to think, oh, if I'm going to do, and maybe we should just define these words, but if I'm going to do a pooled model of isolation where I'm sharing these infrastructure resources across my tenants, then that means I have to pool everything, like every single part of my system, every layer, every microservice, everything has to be pooled, or vice versa. If they think, well, I'm in financial services, so I have to have everything be siloed, and then therefore that means everything has to be siloed, and that's not true. So I always start with identity to make sure everybody's on the same page of who their tenants are, and then that naturally can lead into what are we going to do? How are we going to tackle some of the isolation problems specifically for your business, which is why there's no blueprint.
How about you, Toby? Any particular place you start that discussion?
Same place. Yeah. Just kind of identifying all of the different scenarios too, through which you'd want to kind of to interact with the application, right? Identity, of course, underpins a lot of that, but are we talking, do you have a big corporate Active Directory that you want to bring to this SaaS provider, right? In the enterprise world, like what does that look like and what technologies can enable that? Or are you okay with just having a separate login for all of your users, apart from their, say, corporate environment? So all of those types of things, but again, all underpinned by identity, kind of front and center of that discussion.
And of course, Bill, we have to have where you start.
I hate to have three people all agreeing and saying the same thing, but identity is, so I'll try to put at least a little different spin on it. Identity is critically important. And usually when we're talking about identities, we're thinking about users. And I'll just challenge the people listening to also think about, what if you're working with a SaaS solution where it isn't an actual end user interacting with your SaaS application? What if it's an agent? What if you have some sort of chat client that interacts with your service somehow? And these are all real world cases of customers we've worked with.
Or an IoT device.
Or IoT, right? All very real possibilities that SaaS customers are coming up with, SaaS providers are coming up with really interesting innovation for, but you still need that identity story. You can't just say like, it's IoT. I don't need to think. No, IoT is identity, right? It's entirely based on identity. So are agents and things running in customer account. Everything is identity. And it doesn't just have to be how to identify a user, right? So it's important that you think of that identity, think of all the repercussions of it and what it means for the entire application.
Yeah, awesome. And I guess I think it's probably, I have my own terminology I'm using, but we probably are saying similar versions of the same story. I probably, in my mind, I think of it more like personas, and that maybe that's like a pointy-haired guy kind of view of it. Like but it's I think of it as like I want somebody to think of who are the different kinds of customers of their business going to be, and who are the ones they don't have today, even because I think a lot of people who are starting in the SaaS don't realize part of the value of SaaS is that you can address this spectrum of different users, and don't sort of just assume that whoever you sell today is who you're going to sell to tomorrow. And so for me, that comes down to like, what are the deployment models? I connect it to identity and that it's connected to persona, but what are the expectations of those personas in terms of what they might expect in terms of a deployment model, which kind of comes full circle back to Michael talking about silo, bridge, and pool here. I want to know, like, it could be a legacy reason you're going to have to be silo, or it could be like, or in financial services. But then even there, when somebody says, well, they will make assumptions like, oh, it has to be silo, and they'll just make these black and white sort of things where they're like, well, because we're in a compliance environment, everything has to be in a silo, when in reality, no, it doesn't all have to be that way. So for me, I'm trying to work the tech and the business here together and get them to like really think about who's going to consume the system and what that means to the deployment footprint of your environment, and to what degree are you going to allow different experiences to be available to different users, and make that a value proposition in your business, so that I can say, hey, customer, tier 1, basic tier tenant, you're going to get this experience. Advanced tier tenant, you're going to get this experience, and the value proposition of moving from one to the other is going to be good. And then of course, isolation, everything else fits into that discussion. So but I think it still is driven by who's going to consume this, or maybe Bill, maybe back to your point, what might be consuming this as well. Right. I think I tend to want to know that first, and I feel like that's the bridging sort of conversation between the business and the tech sort of side, because I think tech will often just think about like, we just need isolation. So they're just like, what's that? And they really haven't asked the question, well, what kinds of isolation for what kinds of users and in what contexts do they need that isolation? And it tends to make, to me at least, isolation ends up being a much different story when you're all done with that conversation than maybe where you started.
And I think when you dive into the conversation about packaging your solution and to deliver to the market, and tiering, which I think we should have an entire episode on. I think it can sometimes be overwhelming, especially for the tech folks in the room, to think, oh my goodness, I knew I was going to have to figure out how to isolate, my database or my file system for my 500 customers. But now you're telling me that the business is going to want 3 different ways to isolate, my database or my file system for my 500 customers. Oh my goodness, and it becomes overwhelming. So I think the other thing to think about is realize the entire landscape of where you're headed strategically as a SaaS provider. And like you say, Todd, often SaaS is about opening up new markets. You can go up market, down market. You can broaden your impact with your current customer base. And so I think it's more about understanding, like you say, and we often say, the product team has to work together, and the tech people have to understand the business, and the business people have to understand the tech enough so that you're not making decisions that are going to, be a one-way door that you can't walk out of, or paint yourself in a corner or whatever cute little saying you want. So I think it's the balance of, don't be overwhelmed by all of the things that we would like to achieve. Just understand where we are so that we can make the right decisions for today, so that we can set ourselves up for success tomorrow.
Yeah, I think this connects back to this broader blueprint theme we've kind of got going here, right? Which is that here's an area where you'd think, well, like at least everybody, SaaS companies will end up with similar deployment models or similar isolation models. And at least for me, like the thing I love about SaaS the most is, but maybe is perplexing to somebody who's on the other side building, is I like the fact that pretty much everybody I go to, they're like implementing some different flavor of this. They're still achieving the same sort of core principles, but their architecture based on legacy, based on domain, based on noisy neighbor, based on like all these other tiering considerations, they end up with different architectures. And I feel like that's why, to me, to be a really good SaaS architect, you've got to be the person who's like, what's the mix of these things that's right for my particular customer, right? And if you were to pick up from your current job and go somewhere else, you would have to have that discussion all over again. You couldn't just carry it all with you.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the pros and cons of some of these different models that we have up here? I don't think we've sort of danced around trying to give a hard definition to them, but maybe we don't have to, and instead we can just talk about why you would choose one over the other.
Yeah, let's go there. Yes, let's go there first, and then we'll talk a little bit about another common theme here, which is like why, I guess maybe Toby, I'll put you on the spot a little bit, like why you build EKS, right? And we talked about cluster per tenant or namespace per tenant. We get into those kind of bits. Like, what are the things, if you've talked to different people who are consuming that, are the things that might be the pros and cons of choosing one of those models? And you can come out of EKS if you want there, but whatever you want to do. I don't want to make you EKS guy, but
well, I think it all boils down to the business problem too, like what we were just talking about, right? Like how do you map that to your business needs? And as far as choosing it, it's you're going to rely a little bit on the difficulty there, but also I just lost my train of thought because Alexa was talking to me. Sorry.
Live TV,
awesome.
people.
Maybe Alexa has a point of view on silo and pool. You never know.
Yeah. So, but why you choose it would be your appetite for isolation, right? Like, are we talking, to Michael's point, are we talking financial services, or is it? Do you have can you glum them all together and that's okay? It could be operational efficiency. Is cost a motivator, which again boils down or goes back to business. So a lot of those different dimensions come to.
I do feel like they pull at one another here. There's a bit of a tug of war, right? Which is, the more you use resource isolation, like dedicated resources to solve a problem in SaaS, the more complex the operational footprint gets because you have all these distributed things on a per tenant basis. And the more the more this affects the sort of cost footprint of your application. This doesn't mean that they aren't exactly what you ought to do, but certainly if you look on the other side of that and you say, hey, when we share resources and we share these bits, deployment's easier, operations is easier, cost is more about taking advantage of the scale of and the elasticity of an environment
but it's not all sunshine and roses, right? Because you've got noisy neighbor problems, you've got blast radius, you've got your deployment might actually get a little bit more complicated in some ways because now you've got everybody using this live system that you're trying to migrate. So there's trade-offs, right?
Well,
absolutely. Right.
Also,
like just availability, right? In a pooled environment, it's like, yeah, that's awesome and get all this upside. But if some part of it goes down, it goes down for everybody. Right.
Yeah.
And also supporting the story for moving between those different deployment models, right? You got the free tier and you're offering your customers a taste of this stuff and now all of a sudden they convert. What does that look like? Right now they're a paying customer. Can you lift them out of their free tier and all of a sudden put them in a siloed stack easily? Like that's a difficult problem sometimes.
That transition's tough. Yeah.
There's a degree of sophistication that goes into a pooled model that you have to be ready to implement. You can't just simply say we're going to throw things in together and hope the outcome is good. You have to really be deliberate about how you do it. You have to have the coding resources to go in and have conversations about dynamic policy generation or deeply understand tools like IAM or other security tools, or else you're not creating the type of tenant isolation experience your customers need. So, in some ways, silo is easier to get started, but pooled, there's a lot of benefits there too. Just know what you're getting into and be prepared to lock that down.
Yeah, and I do want to, because I always felt like this is, and I think I've probably beat this one to death in a bunch of talks I've done, but we use this term silo and pool, and by the way, like all the way back to the beginning of our discussion, you'll notice we never say single tenant anywhere. Michael kind of hinted at this already, right? Like we intentionally use words like silo and pool to get away from the notion of tenancy. It's an intentional effort on our side to say, let's just talk about the deployment footprint of these, and it's all multi-tenant. But for me, then it also becomes often these coarse grain discussion where somebody wants to say, I'm silo, and this is what we've hinted at here is like, no, there's a version of silo for a specific use case for a certain part of your application. So for me, I like to be, if people are building like microservice-based applications, and not everybody has to build microservices, there's tons of ways to do this, but the idea still should connect here, which is, however I'm decomposing my system, in this case, microservices, I'm really making silo pool decisions on a service by service basis, right? Like the reality is my application might, in this example, I have like an order service where we've separated the compute, but the storage is pooled, right? But then I've got a product service where everything's pooled. And then I've got an invoice service where the compute's shared, but the storage is siloed. There's any number of reasons, like Michael was noisy neighbor, SLAs and blast radius, like compliance, all these things might mean at a very fine level of granularity, you're deciding whether to be silo or pooled for that individual resource. And I think that's actually where the real payoff of this comes in. If you have the luxury of making the decision at this level, you give yourself way more knobs and dials to decide what's my true sort of isolation story, what's my true silo pool story, and you can pivot along the way. Curious if this makes sense or resonates at all.
No, I think that was, one of the things that we tried to bring out in the EKS SaaS reference architecture, right? In the workshop. And the reference architecture was mostly siloed, but in the workshop, we wanted to kind of illustrate that there were, depending on your needs, multiple ways to handle this, and following a model, just like almost what's on the screen here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, what and this is probably soapbox again, so warning here, but for a disclaimer or whatever, but the one thing, sorry, having a hard time getting the right slide. Let's get this slide. The thing that I think that I don't want to get lost in this discussion of silo and pool, because we started out with control plane, and the control plane and its role here is, if I'm account per tenant, for example, if I'm talking AWS bits, if you're not on AWS, you have some probably correlation to an account per tenant, but since we're rooted in AWS, these are the tools we work with, certainly. And if I have account per tenant or VPC per tenant model, even in those models, we still have the same expectation for the control plane. Everything about how they're onboarded, deployed, all those things are still true. And I think sometimes this, for me at least, I see tension around this in discussions with customers, because they will think, well, because we've gone full stack silo account per tenant, that my control plane is somehow not as important or not necessary, or some pieces of it are not necessary. I'm curious, have you guys seen anything like that? Is that an area where you have to like maybe steer a little bit?
I think it may be more complicated,
Mm-hmm.
Because and Toby was bringing this up, when you're running a business, and a lot of these decisions are about complexity and time to market and skill set and cost and opportunity cost, and some of the choices that you could make here obviously would impact how difficult it would be to get. We overuse the term single pane of glass, but this operational view across all of your tenant environments becomes more difficult the more isolated and separated they are at these really coarse grain levels. Account is of course the most coarse grain, and then you're looking at virtual private clouds. You're talking about networking, and then you can and as you get closer and closer and closer, there's easier ways or more direct ways to connect those two halves of your application plane and your control plane together to get them to talk to one another. So I think sometimes, and this maybe is sometimes why people shy away from, to go back to what we were joking about before, eating their vegetables, right? To truly take the time to build a good control plane, that sometimes that can be difficult.
Yeah, I mean, you look at SaaS Boost that we have. I know Michael and Toby have both been deeply immersed in SaaS Boost, and the current version of it uses a VPC per tenant model, right? And if you dig into the nuts and bolts of that solution, and you look at like a lot of what it's automating and a lot of the heavy lifting in that environment, a lot of it centers around this. Like, what does it mean to orchestrate the creation and the configuration and the deployment of this entire VPC? I mean, it's nice because it's a single standalone unit, but it's also a whole bunch of infrastructure that needs to get provisioned and set up on every single time a tenant comes in.
Right. And you get different sort of limits and different footprints that you run into, regardless of whether you're on-prem or with whatever, cloud provider you're on. There are going to be limitations that you're going to have to take into account as you design these different styles of deployment models.
Yeah. It's an unexpected challenge that I think a lot of customers who end out implementing Silo don't see coming. There are limits across the board you're going to run into. How many accounts can you have on your payer account with your cloud provider? How many VPCs can you have? How many different, how much can an API gateway deal with in terms of traffic before you start to run into noisy neighbor problems across the board? All of these different possible limits as you make these decisions could come into play. In some ways, accounts could be easier in terms of limits. VPC could introduce new challenges. Pooled could introduce new challenges. But these are things you want to be talking to different people who've done it before and make sure that you understand what might be coming down the pipe at you. But you also have to be prepared to be flexible on these things too as you learn these limits, and we'll see what you run into.
And honestly, if we sort of take this all full circle, like, to me, this is a lot of why I'm very interested in doing this show, right? Which is, like, we've sort of talked the high level, like control plane, app plane, why blueprints don't matter, why you ought to be in the business. We care about the business side of this and the role of the control in the app plane. But really now it's like, take all of these concepts, noisy neighbor, and all these sort of flavors and considerations that we're talking about that are part of this whole story. And our the goal here now is, like, take this moment as a springboard and, like, let's, like, go crazy into isolation. Let's go crazy into data partitioning. There's a whole family of patterns underneath these sort of meta patterns that we've talked about, where there's just every single one of these two sort of areas get their own nuances, right? Like isolation, we could probably do 5 episodes on just isolation and what it means with IAM or whatever. Data partitioning, it's different on every single service. So for me, I feel like this sets the framework for, like, what's it at the high level mean to, like, land an architecture in SaaS. But the good stuff, the stuff I hope we get to sort of, like, dig into down to the code level here, is the stuff underneath all of that, right? That's where I feel like we're going to be able to tease out a lot of the bits here that I think hopefully people are interested in and knowing more about. But you can see how this discussion of silo and pool and these deployment models and the control plane and the app plane, they're table stakes to me in this discussion. Mm-hmm. So for me, now we can move, going forward, we'll kind of move on and we'll start digging inside those boxes and not really talking about what's going on. Anybody, like, I think would kind of, like, went full circle on this. I certainly want to maybe add some parting thoughts here, but you guys have any last thoughts on
I was just thinking, we've got a few people in the live audience here and a couple of comments. Todd, I didn't know if you wanted to sort of reflect a little bit.
That's the whole point. If there's some comments out there, let's
so I guess a couple of different comments here. One, which we touched on earlier in the hour, which is the idea: should the control plane be viewed as another product that your teams have to build? And I think the answer is yes, but don't build it in a vacuum from the solution that you're providing to your customers. The functional and non-functional requirements have to be melded together so that you get the right operational experience for whatever it is that's in your application side. And obviously anybody else can jump in here, but there's one more question, and Toby, you really touched on this a little bit before. So are there best practices, or maybe this is a topic that we can pick up in another episode? How do you think about moving a tenant as a tenant goes through its life cycle of registering and renewal, and maybe now they want to move tiers, and maybe moving tiers means moving to a different deployment model? How do we think about that? And are there best practices and patterns there?
I mean, I don't know that I could prescribe any best practices per se, other than to to make sure that that's top of mind, right? Like if you've got everybody, let's say all of your free tier tenants are in in their own database, siloed for the free tier, but pooled within that tier. And now you somehow have to extricate one tenant's data from a shared database and plop them into its own database or something like that. All things to be thinking of, right? Like, so, yeah, just making sure that's top of mind, making sure that,
Todd, your personas, right? Understanding like who are going to be your customers and what are their expectations going to be.
I think Toby said the most important thing there is, are you thinking about what that transition ought to look like, right? Because to me, I can think of, well, we talked about all these different deployment models. What are they deploying from and what are they deploying to? And that path obviously could be, this is back to the notorious "it depends" kind of answer, right? Which is, it's sort of like what kind of storage is there? Are you microservices? Are they like I've got 100 questions about what it would mean for you to move, but if you've at least thought about what it means to move, and you have some notion of of who would move and why they would move, you would also begin to connect that to what it might mean to move. But the what is always going to be a long discussion of who you are. I mean, this even gets back to like, what does it mean for a tenant to be disabled? How long should you keep the tenant? How long should you keep their data? What if they want to come back? Like, there's all these life cycle questions that the business ought to care a ton about, right? And those life cycle questions can have a huge impact on the cost of your solution. It could even affect scale. It could affect lots of things. So for me, these are the things you kind of got to poke at.
We made it to 55 minutes without it depends, and we almost made it through the show.
Yeah. Well, and Bill, do you have any parting thoughts there before I maybe wrap up?
No, it's great to see some live comments. Follow up with us. We have at least one there that I don't think we're going to get to before we have to wrap up. But it's great to see the participation, and we look forward to talking to you guys again in a couple of weeks, right?
Yeah, and if one of you could drop, I know we have some links here that were available. If you could drop some of them in the chat, we did have I know there was a reference to a talk on reference architectures. I did at reInvent it sort of gets around these themes and it has a little more time to dig into them than maybe we did here. And we also, I've included links just to reference architectures just because you can see some of this stuff come to life in the reference architectures. And I've pointed, I think, at SaaS Lens as a link here that would be useful just because it's a broader, if we're in this broader sort of discussion, a lot of the content around that's well-architected SaaS Lens could be useful. But for me, I don't know. I really thanks to all of you for joining, both those of you who have joined the stream, but also Toby, Michael, Bill. I really appreciate you sort of adding your thoughts and here. I do feel like this gave us a good sort of foundational bit of SaaS insight, and I'm really looking forward now to the in-depth versions that we really know the builders, developers, architects want to get to. Like we are Show Me SaaS here. And if we're going to be Show Me SaaS, we've actually got to show you some of the nuts and bolts that are underneath all of this. So hopefully, though, this first episode's been helpful to all of you, and I really look forward to having you join us for our next episode in 2 weeks. So thanks so much, everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.